has a face, and you must make a friend of horror.
How do we confront our nightmares? Do we cover our eyes from the evils that be, or can we learn to tackle them head on? That's the challenge we face, both in everyday life and as spectators of a horror movie.
It's also the question running through the mind of Danny in both film adaptations of Stephen King's The Shining and Dr. Sleep, a series about the trauma faced by the Torrance family at the hands of an abusive alcoholic father.
These films have frightened and disturbed generations of people with their cryptic imagery and themes. They're also some of the most startlingly realistic horror films ever made.
If we're going to unpack the baggage of these two movies, we have to first talk about the writing approach of their creator, Stephen King.
King has had a very distinctive writing style that incorporates terrifying spins on the everyday lives of normal people. The nightmares he creates are often ones we can instinctively fear, such as clowns, cars, toxic fans, and abusive parents.
But more unique to King's style is the way in which he imbues his characters with deeply human problems and emotions. Even if they turn out to be vile, destructive villains, he'll often take great care to show us the systems that push them into darkness.
Part of the reason King was so upset by Stanley Kubrick's version of The Shining is because of the detached, unsympathetic way Jack Torrance treats his family. In the novel, he ends up telling his son to run away from him and his wife to escape the evil that's taken over Jack. In the movie, we're shown a detached, inhumane patriarch dominating over his family with no remorse.
Here's Johnny!
It's right in line with Kubrick's style and, more importantly, his philosophy.
We can't talk about The Shining without discussing its notorious production, in which Kubrick subjected actress Shelley Duvall to months of emotional and psychological abuse. She was constantly forced to redo takes, gaslit, and demean in front of the crew, at one point suffering a panic attack on set.
Going through day after day of excruciating work, it was almost unbearable. During the day, I would have been absolutely miserable.
Maggie Mayfish covers this more extensively in her video comparing Kubrick's Shining to David Lynch's Lost Highway. In it, she details the misogynistic, oppressive way Duvall was treated not just on set, but in the wake of the film's release.
Kubrick's disturbing means of control permeates throughout the cold, desolate subtext of his movie. His frequent use of distancing, abstract editing, and unsettlingly slow camera work creates a detached, dreamlike terror within your mind.
The Shining's cold outlook on the nature of abuse can be interpreted both literally and metaphorically. Much of the film hints at the disturbing nature of large-scale oppression. You can view Jack as a stand-in for many types of oppressive systems in Western civilization.
This is why the Overlook Hotel is filled with stolen Native American iconography, subtle hints of the Nazi war machine, and even its own explicitly haunting history of murder and destruction.
The site is supposed to be located on an Indian burial ground, and I believe they actually had to repel a few Indian attacks as they were building it.
My predecessor in this job hired a man named Charles Grady as the winter caretaker, and he ran amok and killed his family with an axe.
Not every reading of The Shining's subtleties has merit, like the idea that it's a metaphor for Kubrick faking the moon landing. But there are several layers to his dark outlook on power structures.
It's part of the reason The Shining has influenced so many horror movies. The idea of an unstoppable slaughter at the hands of an abusive, destructive man can be expanded upon in many different ways.
The Shining's depiction of white supremacy, for instance, is more closely examined in Get Out, just as The Lighthouse deconstructs patriarchies and Hereditary further explores domestic trauma. And then there's Dr. Sleep.
Stephen King published his sequel to The Shining in 2013 after wanting to further explore the impact of Danny Torrance's childhood trauma. Much of the preceding story was based on King's struggle with alcoholism, with both serving as an outlet for his inner frustrations and anxieties.
The novels often use the supernatural as an embodiment of domestic abuse and alcoholism, but the film version of The Shining differs in its cold outlook on the human condition. If Kubrick's movie is about how oppression isolates and brutalizes us, then Mike Flanagan's explores how we can come together and heal from that trauma.
When I first met you, I told you that you should hide, that you should keep your head down, keep your shine out of sight. But I was wrong.
It's rare to see a horror movie that deals so heavily with empathy, as most deal with the terror that fear and isolation can stir within us. But Mike Flanagan has a different approach, and one that a lot of horror directors can stand to learn from, especially in their means of production.
The empathy that's intrinsic to the DNA of Dr. Sleep is a large part of how he directs his actors. The cast and crew all spoke incredibly fondly of how he handled their performances, and it stands in stark contrast to how Kubrick treated Shelley Duvall in The Shining.
If I was doing anything off the character, then Mike would step right in. But he also lets us have a lot of freedom to sort of play with how we feel these characters would be.
Consider the difference in what Kubrick says about horror.
There's something inherently wrong with the human personality. There's an evil side to it. One of the things that horror stories can do is to show us the archetypes of the unconscious. We can see the dark side without having to confront it directly.
and what Mike Flanagan believes.
Horror is the safe space for us to take a hard look at the darkest corners of who we are. But underneath it all, it's a catharsis that isn't about indulging these dark ideas. It's about confronting them. We can also say, this is why it's important to stand up in the world when you see an injustice. This is why it's important to shine.
Notice the difference in their language? Kubrick emphasizes a lack of confrontation in his horror, whereas Flanagan focuses on a safe space to deal with our problems.
None of this is to say that The Shining is without merit. It's still an exceptionally well-made psychological horror with some really talented artists working on it. But most of its distant, cold look on destructive behavior masked as a loving father figure is in service to Kubrick's goal, to show us without confronting.
And considering how dark and twisted the subject matter of modern scary movies can be, it's a pretty bold move to choose empathy as the centerpiece of one.
The ending of The Shining does indeed remain one of the most enigmatic scenes in all of cinema. It's a shot that lingers with you because of its haunting simplicity. There's not a river of blood or a fiery immolation in sight.
The juxtaposition between an abusive murderer and the wealthy elites who run our society is diminished by the framing, the costuming, and the date. Regardless of when they were born, where they're from, or who they exploit, the corrupt and powerful are all cut from the same cloth.
They're all enjoying the same corrupted party that's been funded by a system of neglect and abuse. It's a disquieting, horrific truth that's proven far too real for a lot of people. But Dr. Sleep suggests a possible step away from this madness.
Throughout the whole film, we see Danny building relationships, helping those in need, and actively communicating his vices and fears. It's very uncommon to see this, especially in horror movies. The whole climax is him literally unpacking his demons he stored up over the years, yet the film never shames him for compartmentalizing them. It was just another step in the long process of moving through your trauma and learning to accept that while the world is full of monsters, life can still go on.
Even Danny's death isn't seen as an unpleasant moment of finality, since the empathy he instills and the connections he's built allow him to survive. The Shining's depressing, black and white worldview is unsettling, but it isn't the only approach a scary movie can take.
After all, the thing about horror is that it does indeed have a face, but what makes it unsettling is that it's constantly shifting and changing to play with your emotions. It can be cerebral, psychological, theatrical, grotesque. And sometimes it spawns a range of emotions that are just beyond words.
Dr. Sleep is by no means a perfect movie, but it's an interesting perspective for horror movies to consider. If the genre is to truly evolve, then a more humanist approach may be the way to go. And this wouldn't make the movies less scary. Take it from the man himself.
There can be no horror if there isn't caring and love. That's very important, and I think a lot of filmmakers miss that, and Mike doesn't. Mike understands.
Shine on, Aberstone. You shine on.
Eyes of blue, but oh, what those 5 foot could do. Has anybody seen my girl? Turned up nose, turned down hose, flapper, yes sir, one of those. Has anybody